The truth about Bitcoin and inflation. Bitcoin is often touted as a hedge against inflation, but despite that, even though inflation is at a 40-year high in the United States right now at 9.1%, Bitcoin price has been down this year. In this video, I'll examine the arguments for and against whether Bitcoin is truly a hedge against inflation. And if you enjoy these sorts of topics, be sure to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. First, let's examine the arguments about why Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation. The most common of these arguments is that Bitcoin is scarce. We know exactly how many Bitcoin exist right now, how many will ever exist, and the schedule on which they'll be released at, and they'll be released in a manner that is totally fair because it's based on how much proof of work people can contribute to the network. DeFi educator Shivsak described this argument as follows. Inflation is often caused by excessive money printing or rapid increases in money supply. But Bitcoin is immune to these problems since it has a fixed supply and a predetermined monetary policy. And so that's the argument about why Bitcoin's scarcity would lead to it being an inflation hedge. Additionally, another argument is that it's becoming increasingly recognized as a store of value. You have individuals, companies, and even in some cases nations like El Salvador adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet and holding Bitcoin as a way of preserving some of their wealth. Other inflation hedges, like gold historically, have also served this role, so that bolsters the argument that perhaps Bitcoin could be the digital gold. More on that in a second. Another reason why Bitcoin is argued to be a store of value is the fundamental value of the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin network provides a permissionless, fair way to store value, to make transactions, to make cross-border payments, and so on and so forth. And you need Bitcoin to pay for access to that network. So that creates some amount of utility that Bitcoin will always be used for. Advocates for Bitcoin have often compared it to other historical hedges against inflation. The most common of these has been gold, and Bitcoin's even been called digital gold. Gold historically was used as a store of value where people, kings, countries, organizations would hold gold to store their wealth because they always knew they'd be able to find someone who would trade goods or services for that gold. Bitcoin has also been compared to digital real estate. Michael Saylor, the MicroStrategy CEO and American billionaire, said, "Let's talk about the crypto universe. You've got digital property, and Bitcoin is the highest, most dominant digital property network. Think of it as granite blocks in Manhattan in cyber Manhattan. So Bitcoin is meant to last forever, high integrity, very durable." So that is the comparison between Bitcoin and high-end real estate somewhere like Manhattan, where there's a finite amount of that real estate, and as the money supply changes, increases, is hyperinflated, you always know that that real estate will have some fundamental value. And the final comparison to a traditional inflation hedge, which has become increasingly common recently, is energy. And energy, in fact, has one of the best claims to being an inflation hedge because during periods of high inflation, including this current year, the energy sector has done very well. So the argument for Bitcoin is that because Bitcoin is a proof of work coin, each Bitcoin represents a certain amount of hash power that was contributed to the Bitcoin network. And what is the standard bottleneck for the Bitcoin network? It's how much electricity people can get. So you could argue that Bitcoin is electricity made into money. And so by that argument, you can argue that if energy is an inflation hedge, then perhaps Bitcoin is a commoditized version of that energy. And those are the main arguments for why Bitcoin is an inflation hedge. We'll circle back in a second to assess whether those hold weight. Now let's look at the arguments for why it isn't an inflation hedge. The first of these is that although Bitcoin is scarce, that doesn't necessarily equal value. Famous author and crypto critic Nassim Nicholas Taleb said, "Scarcity does not equal inflation hedge. A lot of things are scarce and have collapsed in value." And if you think about it, you can think of a number of things that would be considered scarce, but are not very valuable. For example, artwork between artists who lost popularity, land and cities where many people left, like Detroit, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of examples of things that had a limited quantity, but did not end up being particularly valuable. And that's because Scarcity means limited supply, but you still need demand to increase the price. You can't just have limited supply. Another common argument against Bitcoin as an inflation hedge is that it takes time for something to be proven as an inflation hedge and be accepted as a store of value. Let's not forget that Bitcoin is still relatively new. It hasn't gone through a full financial cycle yet, so we will see as we go into potentially a recession and a long-term equities bear market over the next few years. How does Bitcoin react, and is it able to hold up that role of a store of value? And so in that case, the argument is just that we don't have enough information yet. The final argument that I've seen about why Bitcoin isn't an inflation hedge is empirical, and that is, if you look at this past year, as inflation has increased, that has not necessarily translated to a price increase with Bitcoin. And in fact, Bitcoin has underperformed inflation throughout the past year and a half. Now, there are some problems with this argument. However, it is true that if you look at Bitcoin compared to tech stocks, it shows a very high correlation with the NASDAQ. In fact, if you look at it since the start of 2018, you can see that when the NASDAQ had its major run-ups, Bitcoin, if anything, was an exaggerated version of that movement. It peaked around the same time as the NASDAQ, it dropped at the same time as the NASDAQ, and then it started to bounce back this month at the same time as the NASDAQ. And so what is my take on all this? Well, first, to address the most pertinent argument about Bitcoin being an inflation hedge, let's look at its performance over the past year and its high correlation with tech stocks. The problem with that is that you can really divide the Bitcoin value into two different types of value. You have the fundamental value, which is the value of the Bitcoin network and the demand for Bitcoin as a long-term store of value. Then on top of that, you have the speculative value. That is people who are buying Bitcoin because they think the price is going to be higher in the near or mid-term. And so over the past couple of years, you had that speculative value get enormous and probably even bigger than the fundamental value was in absolute terms. And so now, as the economy has turned down, as inflation has gone up, that speculative value has decreased, like the stocks of many tech companies decreased. And so as the speculative value got compressed, the value of Bitcoin went down. However, if you look at the fundamental value of Bitcoin, if you look at the number of addresses, for example, they are still continuing to increase on a long-term horizon. If you look at the number of nodes on the Lightning Network, they're still continuing to increase on a long-term horizon. And so this got me thinking, there are countries right now that are going through hyper or extremely high inflation. How are they using Bitcoin? And if you look at just a few examples, you can see that the answer is they are actually using Bitcoin quite a bit. For example, if you look at Venezuela, which is notorious for its extreme inflation, often in the thousands of percentage points each year, the UN ranked Venezuela as the third highest crypto adoption of any country. Additionally, if you look at Turkey, for example, Turkey had extremely high inflation over the past few years, and according to DW.com, Turkey witnessed a Bitcoin frenzy amid economic turmoil. In another example, Nigeria, which has been suffering from double-digit inflation, has seen drastically increased crypto adoption. Reuters wrote, Nigerians are turning to crypto for business to protect their savings as the naira loses value and to send payments abroad because it is often hard to obtain US dollars. So you have a situation where countries across the world that are suffering from hyperinflation or extremely high inflation are turning to Bitcoin. Why is it then that Bitcoin isn't benefiting from high inflation in the United States? And this got me thinking, maybe we're thinking about Bitcoin's relation to inflation all wrong. When most people talk about Bitcoin as an inflation hedge, they think of it as being tied to CPI. If the consumer price index is up 10%, they'd expect Bitcoin to be up 10%. But that doesn't necessarily reflect what an inflation hedge means. A better way to think about it might be as a lifeboat, where in a situation of extreme inflation, like you're seeing in Venezuela, like you're seeing in other countries, then Bitcoin is a way to escape from a collapsing financial system, almost like insurance. So at 10%, maybe Bitcoin's value hasn't fully kicked in yet. But at 100% or 1000%, suddenly Bitcoin is a great hedge against your country's currency because it allows you to remove yourself from a banking system. And keep in mind, when hyperinflation happens, a lot more things tend to happen as well. You have extreme financial uncertainty, which leads to all sorts of government regulations like currency controls, sometimes restrictions on transferring money out of the country, freezing bank accounts, and more. So we've been thinking of Bitcoin as a ship that rises and falls with the tides of inflation, but in reality, it's a lifeboat to get off a sinking ship. And so that is my take on whether Bitcoin is an inflation hedge. You can think of it as a life raft in periods of extreme financial uncertainty that allows you to escape a collapsing monetary system. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, this is Dynamo DeFi.